Um, so to give kind of a high-level view of this,
Who's doing it?
a high-level view of this, a high-level view.
A high-level view.
I'm on 2. Is that better? Could be more lower. Okay. I'm very soft-spoken, so by the time I get doing things, you probably won't hear me. So we're going to start out with a cube. The first step is turning the cube like this. So you're going to go down the middle of the cube and then kind of create one side, and then this will get chucked on or the tenon will be chucked. Once the tenon is chucked, then you get a chance to turn kind of like you would a normal bowl. You hollow out the inside of there, and then you turn it around and you use some magic to chuck it again, jam chuck it this time, and then you finish the bottom of it. So that's what we're going to go through. Those are the kind of 4 steps, maybe 5 steps, because this is really 2 steps. You first have to shape that piece there. I think you can probably play with the steps if you like it going a little bit different. So I started out with this with a very simple goal. This is one of the first pieces I did as a final piece. This is maple, and you can take a look at that. It's like you can only turn so many of those without figuring out what am I going to do with it. So I did actually get to a point where it's like, well, it could be a stand for a bowl. It could be a stand. We did the spheres, and I like those. It's a nice augmentation to that. And I even, I don't know if you've seen cake plates, you know, so you could actually use this, and you could even glue them together, I guess, and make it one piece if you want. But it's a way to get, again, the 3-pointed piece available. I have messed up on them, so there's one I messed up on. I was like, okay, it doesn't have a bottom, it's just the top. And talk about tops, I actually made a top, and it does spin, so that's kind of fun. This was my first version of a ring dispenser piece, and I think my wife said you can't put enough rings on there, so I got to figure out something a little different. The piece that kind of inspired me was this piece. So it's got the 3-pointed piece here. The upper part of the ornament, I've done the 4-sided inside out. This is a 3-sided inside out, so I had to figure that out, so that was fun. But the top and the finial are glued together, and it allows that middle part to spin. And the other one, I got back from my wedding, and Effie had said, well, I saw one, and instead of coming up to a point, it came down. So here's my attempt to do that. And the cutoff piece, I made a little top. So I think if you put holes, it could be for potpourri. It's kind of small, maybe to use for that. But these are more conceptuals, like how would you do this? So, and one of the things, again, Effie is a pretty good inspiration. I tell him something, he gives me a challenge. Well, can you do this? So the very first one that went around, I mean, it pretty much comes in the middle, and I had to actually kind of go flat in the middle to keep from going through because of the angle of the curve. Well, this one, you know, Effie said, well, can you make, you know, the one side legs for the bottom of a bowl and the other side be the bowl on the top? So I intentionally tried to make it more of a bowl shape here, and this is one of the better ones. And some of these I didn't sand and finish and all that. There's kind of a lot of production to see what can you do. So now I'll take you through the steps here. As far as tools, primary tools, I'm using a spindle gouge in the first step, and then after that, primarily I'm using a bowl gouge. And those are the only 2 tools from gouge's perspective. I do use a parting tool at one point. I found it a little bit easier safer. I didn't break anything using, parting off the tail end of it. And then I've got some other specialty tools that you may need depending on the shape that you decide to go with. As far as chucks, I use the kind of a pin chuck. And these are all from in the back, so it's stuff that's available here. A regular small size 2-inch chuck. But when you start this whole thing out, you really are just going between centers. So I don't know if you saw the PowerPoint when it was playing, but it was kind of fun taking those pictures that you first mount it up and then you start it rolling, and it's kind of freaky looking when it rolls. So when I first do this, before I tighten it too much, I want to make sure I'm getting the edges here. You got 3 edges, that's how you get your 3 points. I'm getting the edges here lined up, and just tighten it slowly until I know that I've got, bring this out a little bit. I know that I'm actually getting those 3 edges kind of equally, so that that center of the spindle goes right through those points. So if you want it to be symmetrical looking, then you actually have to have a good cube. So I brought some tonight, put them in the auction. If you have other woodworking tools, you can do that. There's no pin on this one. This is one of the top turners, tailstock live centers. So it's got the pin out of it. Now, when I was at home, I don't have one I can take the pin out of, so I would use my mandrel saver. Now, the hole in the mandrel saver is a little bit smaller than the hole in the live center. So since I was going to do the demo here and I came in to practice Saturday to make sure the machine would work and do what I wanted it to do, I used this one here. So I wanted to try and use tools here so somebody could bring a cube in here and they would be good to go. Once I get it in there, I don't mind tightening it really tight, because I have thrown a few of these, and be forewarned and fairly warned. But for the most part, no, I'm doing okay with not throwing them at this point. As far as a tool rest, I like the smaller one. So if you get there, make sure you don't get stuck with a big one, because that gets awkward, especially between centers if it's tight, depending on the size of the cube. So, and then the fun begins when you turn the thing on. So it was kind of interesting. The first time I did this, I was almost mesmerized by looking at the shape here, and I was like, oh, well, the corners are naturally there, just watching it spin. One of the reasons I chose this lathe, one, I wanted to show you didn't need a big hunking Powermatic to do this. The other one is it's got a digital readout, so I could tell you, well, I'm going about 2,200 RPMs right now. So the first step is going to be forming on the inside, carving out the inside and forming the shape of that boil. The easiest way to do that, I will be technical safe here. The easiest way to do that is to just do an angle cut. You don't have to worry about forming a bowl the first time you do it. You can do just a pretty simple, straightforward cut. So, but you work in the middle, downwards towards the middle, but start in the middle and work back to the points. So I can see I'm not quite in the middle on that one, but that's all right. And some of them, sometimes you try to do that on purpose. It's important to kind of stop and take a look at how well you're doing, because if you got the tool marks, it gives you a chance to get rid of those before it's too late. It's hard to come back to this even when it's chucked up and try and do that without causing some issues. But you can see that's a very basic kind of angle cut, and you get the curved outline, you know, showing there, even though my cut is not curved, it's going straight in. So that's part of the fun result or mystery is like, well, it didn't have to work hard to get that natural shape in there. Now, on this one, it comes to a point. There's a couple up here. I actually used the beading tool, and I put a bead in the middle. Did you want to? Okay. Yeah. And then on this one, you know, I used the parting tool, and I did it straight. And it was kind of like, well, you know, once you have done a few cubes, all of a sudden it's like, well, I got to be creative here. So what can I do a little differently? So, and then, you know, I even thought, well, I've got a specialty tool, and, you know, that's just a round scraper. And you could put that in there and put a little round curve in there if you wanted a cove, right? But you have to be careful. Obviously, you have to have smaller tools when you start doing that. One of the tools I had to make with one of the first ones was just a really thin point. You know, most of your point tools are wider than that, and I had to get a very narrow point. So that was just take it to the grinder and make a point tool out of it. So what I would do in that case to get in there, and I found, you know, getting that handle up and hitting it low really helped to get in there and not get a catch. If you go straight in on the thing, I tended to get a catch. So that helps you if you want to get that really sharp point in there that you'll see on one of the ones I passed around. So I'm going to go ahead and do another cut on this one, see if I can move it in the middle a little bit better, but sometimes design changes as you turn, right? So, you know, a problem with the spindle gouge is going to be, you know, the angle here. Is that as tight as the angle that you're trying to create? And if it's bigger, you end up a problem because you start hitting the other side of the wood. This one actually seems, you know, fairly decent as far as that. One of the things I found, I learned a lot more. You really have to push down hard on the spindle gouge because you're going so far off the tool rest and you want to keep it steady. So to help steady the tool, I probably push more on it here than I do, you know, doing a finial, and you don't need much pressure on the tool on this one because you're going in and you're taking out a lot of wood pretty quick. You do need that. So the next step is making the tenon on the bottom. And my preference, I think there's different ways you could do it. My preference would be to realign the angle of the tool rest so that it's lined up with the angle of the box. Then you know you got some pretty good clearing there. And this one I've used both spindle gouge and bowl gouge. I think the bowl gouge is a little bit easier to use. So there's essentially is the tenon, and I did use the spindle gouge just to straighten that tenon up a little bit. Then I like to go ahead and start hollowing out, but you can't do it all the way or you lose the tenon, obviously. So, but I like getting these corners done, and I also want to see the shape. So it's really key in my mind, and I've done some designs where I actually tried to not make it even all the way across, but if you do bowl turning, you know, there's a big thing about having the thickness consistent. And so if you really need to hollow out far enough in so that you can tell that this line is going on the inside hollowing is following the line on the outside. If you just do the points, you don't see what's going to happen in the middle yet. So I like it because it's the wood's a lot more stable now. Later on, when you're getting rid of the tenon, and the way you have to mount it in the jam chuck, it's not going to be nearly as stable. So I'd rather do the riskier stuff or the harder stuff early on if I can. And then if you mess up, you can throw it out and start over. You haven't lost that much time. So I learned a couple things with this. It's really, for me, an exercise of turning a lot of air. I've heard Anthony and others say a lot of times, you know, speed is your friend. And so on my lathe at home, I moved it over to the third belt and I cranked the thing up, and I was like, it is pretty good to go much faster. So for certain turnings, if you can get up there 2,500, 3,000 RPMs, it really helps a lot, makes the turning a lot easier. But you have to be comfortable doing it. It also helped as far as learning to ride the bevel while you're turning the air. So that's kind of interesting how you do that. You pick up little tricks. Oh, the last thing was the tailstock tends to get in your way. If you are used to doing bowls, you don't have a tailstock there, it's in your way. So I ended up having to kind of learn to cut with the handle a little bit higher than I would if I was doing a bowl. I'd be going more straight across. So you'll see me with the handle up higher. So this is my check for this gap right there. And it's a little wide here. So I'm going to try another swipe on it, which means I'm going to take very little off of here and go in a little deeper as I end up there. And so what I tend to do is just barely get a fuzz coming off, and by the time I get in there, I want to get about a 16th, 32nd of an inch off. So the light is on. I don't know if it helps or not. Is it in the way for what you're doing? Okay. It also helps. I think my eyesight is not as good as it was 20 years ago. So imagine that. In this group, you know, hard to believe.
You're the only one.
You also notice that I'm turning the gouge as I'm going in. So I'm starting with the cutting edge very straight, and then I start turning it as I go in. I wasn't doing the first couple cuts, and I got a little catching going on there. So that's not quite perfect, but it's pretty good. Well, I guess it depends which side yeah. So you can look on different sides and get a slightly different view of it, so be careful with that. So we're done. We're at this phase here, 2 and 3, or 1 and 2, I don't know. Any questions about anything so far?
The wood you're turning is poplar?
I'm turning poplar, and I actually, and this was more because I wanted to do all the demonstration pieces. It's also a softer wood, so I knew I could rush through the demo faster, because I think if I was using a really hard piece of wood, it probably would take me an hour and a half. And this is actually from a 2x4. So I brought it into the shop here, and I squared it up really good, cut it into a 9-inch, 9.5-inch section, glued them together. So it's about a 3-inch square. But you'll see a little bit of line, the glue line that's here. Actually, one of the challenges I have for myself is to try and turn this. And again, it's on a lathe. It's a little bit bigger than this, but it'll be a challenge. I actually tried this once. I was telling somebody earlier, and I decided to bring these in for Sean. This is what happens when the first time you try something that big and you haven't learned quite as much. And so I just wanted everybody to know that, well, you know, sometimes it doesn't work. If anybody comes in here and tells you that, well, they've tried to, I may find it. Well, I figured I'd bring it in here. Sean would glue it back together, and he'd bring it in as his challenge piece. So. So the tenon I made on this is smaller. You know, I hadn't really, and maybe on that one I'll need to do a full 2-inch tenon, but and I hope I got the size right, because I'd hate to have to chuck it up and have to make the tenon smaller. So I just barely tighten it on this side, and then I go ahead and bring in the tailstock and make sure I've got it centered, because, you know, for whatever reason, I'm a little suspicious that you can never on this one quite get it centered right. So if there's a little bit of movement, I bring in the tailstock just barely up against there. And then, you know, tighten this up so I know that it's seated on those 3 edges there. And then I can go ahead and tighten up the chuck. And that's good. And then, again, I hate not having the stability, so I go ahead, even though I got it chucked up, I go ahead and tighten up the tailstock so that I can part it off when I get to that point without being too fearful of it. And this is pretty much a repeat of the last part, other than you get rid of the whole thing. You're not going to create a chuck here. So for the large one, and because I was going to be repeating what I do, I've threaded these things, and I made a triangle that fits the angle of the sides. So, so these, I'll show you one of each. Well, maybe go the other way. This way. So this has been threaded to the 1-inch spindle thread, and then the other side, you know, I had these 1/4-inch pieces of wood. Had to get the right 60-degree angle slanting in. But then when it seats up to there, it's got a much better seating than just sitting on the edge of that piece there. So, so that was more stable. But again, on a smaller piece, it doesn't make sense. This works fine. As I got to larger pieces, like on that one, I really did need something like that. On the tailstock, as long as we're talking about some things, this was primarily sold as something to help you reverse chuck a bowl. So you have it in the chuck and you screw it into here and then you jam it into your tailstock. Well, I've found that since it's a 1-inch, I can go ahead and boom, I've got my tailstock live center. So you can make custom live centers that way. So that was kind of another neat thing that I have available to do some stuff. And then the other thing is, you know, with the tailstock, if you have really awkward tailstock, I'll use an extender. So you can actually throw this in and throw the live center, and this pushes you out away from the end of, and it's very thin and narrow. It kind of helps avoid, or even on the headstock, if you've got a large headstock like on the Powermatics, they're real square, and you know, this way you get your piece away from that. But, you know, is there a little play in there? I mean, it's a Morse 2 taper, but there might be. So I avoid it if I can. So we'll just go ahead and hollow this out to the point where I can then cut the tenon off and then finish the hollowing on this side. I'm going to stop it now, so I got a chance to correct something, but it looks like it's a pretty good thickness here, so I can go ahead and get another swipe or two and be done in time to take off the tenon. So I don't think it's ever bad to stop and take a look at what you're doing and adjust early on. There's no shame in like, well, if I can't do it in 5 cuts and my eyes closed, it's no good. You know, it's time to get rid of the tenon now. There's lots of different ways or this piece here, it's not really meant to be a tenon, but you know, you can use a spindle gouge and bring it to a point. So I've done that sometimes, but I'm also impatient, so sometimes I'll just go ahead and grab a parting tool to do that. And on that one that was passed around, the maple one that kind of goes up and had the little top, that little top, so this is like the cutoff piece, and I didn't leave as much here, but you know, from this one, you know, this had been cut off of there. This actually became then the top of that other piece after I cut it off. So, you know, you can say it was like, oh, you know, I don't know if it needs a top with it, but you know, you chuck it back up and on this side, and you go ahead and hollow it out, and I put a little in recess there so I could reverse chuck it and make the finial. So, so you can use every piece of the cube if you think about it. But it took me several times to get to that point. So I'm just going to part this off at this point, and it's very stable with the chuck and that sort of thing. So it's not difficult to do this. And, you know, sometimes you part things and you do it with the thing moving. That got close enough. It really doesn't matter at this point. I don't need that piece for anything serious. So I'm going to take the tailstock off to finish the hollowing on this piece. And it's really so close, and the angle of this curve is so good, this should go really fast. I will take and run this way. I like to try and, you know, for a lot of the stuff I was doing here, the height of the tool rest doesn't matter, but on this part, I'm way above the center. And you know that that's going to leave a little nub on the middle, which is not what I want. I want the middle being nice and smooth. So I'm going to test, and that looks like about the right height. Make a cut. If I stop and adjust the height, it's because it's not quite where I want it to be. This doesn't go very deep, so I don't have to worry about angling it in, but if you had a bigger cube and going on a little bit deeper swat, you might have to angle the tool rest in. And I think it's good as you're removing this stuff is to kind of follow that same swing and form that you're trying to get on the whole piece. Otherwise, if you just crank through there and then all of a sudden, oh, I got to get my last cut to be good, it's not going to work. So I try to come in and follow the shape of that wood as much as possible. Do I do sanding on the lathe? Absolutely. In fact, that's a good reminder. I was thinking while I was doing this is when this is done, I will almost sand and finish it. Come to this part, now it's done, I would sand and finish it. Because the further you, when you reverse chuck this, there is no finishing at that point. Yeah, it's all hand sanding if you don't do that. I primarily use something that's the high-speed buffing finish. It's a combination of shellac and walnut oil and denatured alcohol. So, but it's Doctor's Wood is a brand I started with doing, and even I think that Clear Coat is pretty much the same thing, but it's got a little bit more shellac in it. But I like it because then you can apply it, you can buff it up really quick. Sometimes I'll use real thin CA glue as a 1 or 2 coats of that afterwards as well. And depending on what kind of finish you're trying to get, you may sand with a finer grit between coats. So this is rough turned. It's not meant to be a final product. So. I mean, I didn't find it to be much of a problem, but then, you know, with inside out turning, you got the same sort of thing. So this is not sandpaper, but I did bring this as a block, and I brought it for the express purpose to remind me to tell you, if you don't get your cube perfect, and it's like, well, I need to sand this down better or something, wait till there's not much wood left. It's still flat. It still sands. Nice and easy. So don't put more work into it than you have to. So that was the reason I brought that. This is actually just corkboard that I'll be using to reverse chuck it. But if I had the sandpaper, I put pressure in the middle and heavy pressure in the middle and very light pressure on the outside. So that keeps you from modifying the shape and things like that. On that one walnut piece, I didn't quite come to points. when I was shaping it, and you'll see it's a little bit wider. And I had a little chip off on one of the points. So I sanded it down a little bit, and I brought the sander like this. Well, I had to actually reverse sand it because when you do that, of course, you're hitting more on the bottom side and less on the top side. So you end up getting a little slanted. So I reversed it and did it the other way, and it kind of came together okay. But I was thinking, you know, on that, if I wanted points, I could take it out to a belt sander and sand the points in there, because you can follow this back to the points real easy. I've actually taken one of these back out to the belt sander where it's like, oh, I've got this flaw, a little chip off there, I want to hide it all. And you just go boom, 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 and you're done, because it's still flat, right? So so that's the nice thing, is this is still flat like it was when it was a cube. But you're right. I mean, these corners, if you got your bare finger in there, it would hurt going a couple thousand RPMs. So I'm recommending not trying that one. Don't let your fingers go in there. And I found keeping the pressure on the middle is really key to where in light pressure on the outside. And then, you know, if you got a lot of tool marks, you got to start at a lower grit and work your way through that. So the first couple I did, it was pretty bad as I got through these. The poplar being so soft, you see some tear out there, which would require sanding to do. But for the demo, that's okay. So I have, you know, reverse chucked a variety of things, and so I brought these here. This is just a piece of cedar. And this was just, you know, for if you do decks on the outside, you get cedar wood. This is just one of those post things. Got it around. Unfortunately, it's rounded on the corners. So if you want to make a square out of it, that's rough. But, you know, so you get a 4-foot post, and you just cut it up as you need it and turn it into your chuck. If you have enough scrap wood, you don't have to worry about it. So you just go grab a piece of scrap wood. But actually, I like the cedar. It's so soft that you can, it's not going to mar up the harder wood, like, you know, a real hard wood. And it's pretty easy to get it turned to the shape that you need it. So, now it comes off the curve a little bit here, and I think I'll try to change the shape a little bit to be a little bit less of a curve to follow this a little bit. So I may take 2 swipes at that. I think I could get by without it based on the way that it gets chucked up there, but let's see, we still have a few minutes, so not too much of a rush. That's better. You know, the corners kind of hang over anyways, so you can't get it perfect. But so this is the magic part that I think you've all been waiting for. Oh, I need to get the tailstock back up here. And I don't know that you necessarily need, well, you do need to do it at this point because you want to get back to the center. So this is my cushion between the wood and the wood. And try and find the shape. There we go. And this has already been in this tailstock, so it's pretty easy to line up. Falls right into the pieces there and lines up. And this, to me, was the most thrilling, exciting, and kind of inspiring part of the whole thing. There's really no way to grab 3 points like that And if you were here for Jason's demo, I think earlier this year. Now, when I did reverse chuck on that one, I was using Gorilla Tape and duct tape. I wasn't using this stuff. But I was amazed that this stuff actually does very well. So I have a technique where I decided I'm going to do each corner once, straight across the inside of the groove. Then I run a piece of tape around here. And by the way, for the front row, when I said I've lost things, this is one point where I have lost things where I didn't put quite enough tape on, so just be forewarned. And then I come at a slightly different angle on the second one, so I try to get closer to the tape here. Only because you're in the front row. Well, no, actually for most of the stuff I did, this was the blue tape was fine. But when I got something that big on there, I was like, I don't care. I don't know. I mean, it happened so fast. I must have had a catch or something. And like I said, I think I'm the only one in this room, right? But, you know, my basement wall is like 2 feet away. So it was like boom, 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 and pieces all over. It took me, you know, like 2 days to find pieces like, oh, there's another piece over here. So I was just going to throw it away. I found 2 pieces at first, and then I started finding more. I was like, wow, okay. So
Fix it.
So yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, I wish I was recording that one so I could come back and go, oh, that's what I did. But yeah, that's the one where the speed doesn't work. It's going so fast that everything flew really fast. So.
Speed is your friend until it's not.
So I do my second one, and you know, if Howard was not sitting here in the front row, I'd say, well, let's just try it with 2 this time. And then, I don't know, you know, I've got this masking tape. I don't know what else to do with it. I don't know if it's good or not, but I guess we'll find out. So I repeat the same thing with regular masking tape. So essentially, you've got on each corner, you know, 4 strips of tape. You wouldn't think so. I don't know. I mean, Jason had this big thing of cellophane that he wrapped over it, and I was like, why did he saran wrap the thing? I still haven't figured it out. I mean, yeah.
That stretch wrap is really strong stuff.
What is?
Stretch wrap. It's like saran wrap.
Oh, yeah. But the thing is, it doesn't, well, and maybe he's gotten good at doing it, but there's stretch to it. Like I tried one time, you know, it's like I grabbed the electrical tape and I said, oh, let me give it a try. I mean, it just stretched all over the place. It's like as soon as that tool hits it, like you get vibrations. Like, no, I got to have something firmer than that. I like the duct tape because it does give. It will conform a little bit, but once you get it nice and tight, I mean, it's kind of like paper mache or something. So. And
Strapping tape, fiberglass.
So, I mean, the rest of this is, you know, you've already seen it being chucked up. Now you're going to see it with it not being chucked up, but reversed. So, let's see. I think I'll just go ahead and part it off with this one. Okay, you guys ready? I think it's going to stay, but we'll see. So there you go. Sand it, finish it, you're done. So one of the things, I mean, you notice when I started doing the one where it was a bowl and it went down, I had problems with, well, once you've reversed it, how do I know how deep this thing really went? So I measured it, and would eyeball it and then come this way and I'd mark it and I'd kind of know. Even on this one, I didn't measure it. I probably should have made sure I wasn't going to like go through the center point there, but then you can always make a Christmas ornament out of it if you make the hole in there. So, and yeah, I think that's about it. Is there any questions about any of either the pieces or the process here? Yeah. So when you're doing a shape that is more of a bowl shape, traditional bowl shape. So, on this piece here. And I probably could have talked a little bit about it when I had the piece on here, but you can tell that the point was down here on the one and the point's way up here on the other. So as you're turning this, it's a couple different ways I tried doing it. I don't know if this helps visualize it or not, but so instead of the center point being here, you make your center point here. What I found out is you can curve this side down as far as you want, and you still have these three edges. No matter how far and how small you make this piece here, you still have the three edges that make the 3 points. So you can make one side as small as you want, but it's really in that first step when you're doing the inside, you have to make that decision. Do I want to go into the middle? Do I want them to be the same shape, different shape? Do I want to be off to the side? So I had some, and I did think I did one where it's like, okay, I want to be at 2/3, 1/3. That's probably about where this one is. And I just brought my parting tool down till I got to where I wanted the center point to be, and then I just carved from both sides, back and forth, till I got down to that center point. And then you know, like I said, you reverse chuck it and you hollow this out and you're like, okay, you know, I don't want to go through the bottom of a bowl. So, you know, kind of like, you know, marking and, you know, does this go too deep so it's not going to stand on these? You got all those kind of questions to kind of deal with. So you stop, you take a look, you measure the depth on it and see how you want to do it. If if you make it more narrow here, the more narrow the inside point is, the less you got to worry about going through, because then what you have is, you know, this one is very narrow. And so as long as you keep the thickness on here, the bottoms naturally are not going to meet, right? It's probably thicker here than the sides are because you got two bottoms against each other, so you got the thickness of both bottoms. So if you get in deeper, which is a little bit harder, but you got all that support when you're doing that first phase, you can avoid worrying about that. And you can do that whether it's you know, in the middle or on the side like this one was. So it's fun. Like I said, it's really mostly an exercise to turning air. Most of what you're doing is turning air. When you got to the hollowing part, other than whether the tape's going to hold, it's not that bad. The hollowing is, I mean, if you've done hollowing in bowls, you know, you'd be like, this is a pretty small bowl compared to, you know, throwing a 12-inch log on the lathe and trying to make something out of it. So there's tonight's demo you can take a look at.
Recommendations for better wood? I mean, real tight-grained, dense wood?
Well, I mean, it's like anything that's a bowl. So a hardwood versus a softwood. Tighter grain versus the open grain, right? So, I mean, I've turned oak. I don't mind it. I like it in some applications. But you're going to have that open grain. And so, you know, when you sand it, when you are cutting it, you're going to feel it and you go, this is just not quite smooth. And it's really the grain. It has nothing to do with your ability to turn something. So the walnut worked well, hard maple worked well, cherry worked well. So those are woods I used, pass some of those around. And if you get into the exotics, they work very well. So, you know, now, you know, prepping your cube is probably, you know, a challenge. It may be challenging for some people. So I brought some in. They're in the back there. Anybody that wants to try to turn that one for their challenge, let me know. But you know, any of those woods I think turn out really fine. I think one of them that I've got is just this same cedar. It's really soft, but it was like my first attempt at doing something bowl-shaped. So I was like, well, I'll probably catch this and it's going to fly all over, so I don't want to use nicer wood for that. Let me just experiment with it. And it turned out pretty decent. But I mean, it's very lightweight, which is kind of nice. It's not finished, so I don't know if it would look halfway decent finishes. I'd probably put a ton of finish on it to give it a nicer look on the finish. You know, I like the aromatic cedar. I probably would try that because that's pretty tight grained. It's a little bit lighter wood, but it's definitely heavier than this is. I wouldn't recommend this unless the poplar is pretty good as a first turn, but I'm not big on turning a lot of stuff in poplar. So if I know I'm doing outside treatments, it's not so bad. So I'm working on another project I may have in a couple months to show that's out of poplar because it gets painted on the outside. But yeah, so I don't know. Just the standard woods that you would use are fine. You know, certainly like anything you cut down, if you can get it into a cube, you can use it. So I had some pieces in it, you know, just getting those cut out. You know, I spent a couple hours today getting those things kind of cubed up. And it was much better when I brought the poplar in here on Saturday. You can run it across the joiner and the planer, and boom, boom, you're done. It's like 5 minutes, and then it's just a miter saw to cut them into cubes. That's a nice way to go. If you're doing enough product. I mean, if you're going to do one or two, then you're kind of stuck because you can't bring in a 4-inch piece of wood and run it across a joiner without losing a finger. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. I had one or two where one of the corners was a little bit thicker than the other two, and that's pretty hard to correct. You actually have to somehow, I mean, you could do it by hand, I suppose, but then, you know, I showed my wife. She's not a woodturner. She didn't notice it. So I was like, oh, I guess I'm just being a little fanatical about it. But you know, for me, it was I saw something on YouTube, and it was inspired. The first thing I saw was a guy doing the ornament, and just that middle piece, and his didn't spin around, so you know I had to kind of still augment it, like, oh, well, wouldn't it be fun since I'm using different woods to let it spin around? You know, I got grandkids, so it was like that was really what drove me to try it. And then it was like, hey, this is actually a cool shape. And Chris was working for about 3 or 6 months on doing 4-sided pieces that come to points. And you've seen, if you've been at some of the show and tells, you've seen some of the stuff he's done, really cool. The spaceship one or whatever. And so I thought for sure he'd be thrilled, and I forgot, well, he's the one that's going to ask me to do a demo. So, like, oops. But he gave me time. He gave me time to do a lot of practicing and to try some different things out. And once I got through, like, 4 or 5 of them, then all of a sudden the creativity is like, well, you should make it be something, you know, more than just to get the shape, you know, because I had a big struggle with, you know, so it's a nice looking shape, but, you know, nobody wants to buy it, a nice looking shape. And, you know, actually I don't really try to sell my stuff, but, you know, it's like, other than if you had, like, you like turning the sphere and you got a collection of them, you're probably not going to get that many people to buy different things like that. But, so the original shape I thought was more of, like, to help present something else. And then I started, like, trying to make objects, and I was like, well, you can do that.
Got one last question. What's going to be the challenge for next month?
The challenge is turn a cube into something. So even those people that are afraid to go corner to corner, if you start with a cube and you turn something, just explain how you did it. If you turn a cube, I'm assuming you did it somewhat like this. But if you had an interesting quirk, or you did the steps in a different order, you know, share that, because I think that's interesting for people. So put a cube on the lathe, turn it into something, and bring it in.
Even if it's a bag of chips?
Well, if you can prove that it was a cube once.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jack.
It has to be a turning, not just the chips, yeah.
How many people have tried this before? And okay, you still have all your fingers? Yeah. Okay. And what do you think? I mean, was that?
Effie's tried it.
Yeah. Was it exciting? Is something you want to do again? And got other ideas? Is that why we had to buy more Band-Aids? Thanks again, Jack. That was great. Okay. Going to make a few quick announcements, and then we're going to have our break for refreshments and taking a look at all of the silent auction items. Okay. Meet the Artist Dinner. This was on August 25th. A dinner and panel discussion at the 4 Chapters Gallery. It was an absolutely incredible learning experience. We had, 11 of our member artists participate.